Chris, thank you for inviting Otter Tail to be part of the um, agenda this evening and to share our role in Stevens County and Morris and how we have provided service to the area. Just a brief agenda, if you want to advance to the new slide, our presentation will include an overview and a brief history of Otter Tail Power and Morris. We'll plan to discuss how Otter Tail selects and plans its electric generation through resource planning, talk briefly about grid security, reliability, and interconnections, and then what can customers do to add resilience to the grid? Jason will review that through our demand side management. We want to just go ahead, you can move on even to the next slide. Everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up, okay.
Yes.
This slide, I think, does a really good job of showing kind of who we are and where we are. Otter Tail Power is a vertically integrated investor-owned utility. We own our own generation, transmission, distribution, and we've been incorporated since 1907. In this slide, you'll see our service territory is basically the north and western part of Minnesota, a good portion of North Dakota, and then the northeastern part of South Dakota. And you'll note here the diversity of our generation. Our generation resources includes, and you'll see there are 3 coal-fired power plants on the map, but after this month, there will only be 2, as the Hoot Lake Power Plant in Fergus Falls will be retiring, and a 50 megawatt solar facility will be built there in its place. In addition to the 2 coal-fired plants, we have 2 natural gas plants, one near Solway, which is by Bemidji, Minnesota, and the other down near our Big Stone plant area called Astoria Station. We have 4 wind farms, 2 small combustion turbines, which are noted there with the orange, and then 2 solar arrays, one in North Dakota, one in Minnesota. And we also have 6 small hydroelectric facilities that are not noted on the slide, but they are noteworthy as that's where we got our start. This complex generation mix really enhances Otter Tail's ability to be resilient and have redundancy throughout our service territory. On the right side of the slide, you'll see that we serve over 132,000 customers throughout our area, which is a total of 422 communities, and the average population is only 400 people in each of those communities. So having said that, you can imagine that Morris is one of the larger towns that we serve. We also have 11,400 miles of line covering our 70,000 square miles of service territory. If we move on to the next slide, just a little history about Otter Tail and Morris. We have provided service to Morris for over 108 years. Morris was one of the original towns that we added to our service, which was back in 1913. And we did that by acquiring a small steam generating plant, and we strung high lines shortly thereafter. One thing I thought was kind of interesting and a little humorous was back in 1914 was the first time that the lights were turned on, which happens to be St. Patrick's Day in Morris. And the town celebrated the event by throwing a free dance for the Otter Tail Power crew members in honoring them for the work that they had done. And currently, Morris is the 5th largest community that we serve. Now I'll hand it off to Nate, I think.
All right, thanks, Lori. I'm Nate Jensen, manager of our resource planning department at Otter Tail. I'm going to give just a brief overview of the resource planning process and some of the steps we take. You can go to the next slide, Chris. So just from a very high level, excuse me, takeaway, the resource planning department, that's where all of our large utility scale generation projects start. And we go through a pretty complex modeling process trying to determine, what types of generators should we build in the future. We look at our forecasted load growth. We look at all of our existing resources. We look at the potential new resources we have to choose from. We look at different fuel and energy market price forecasts, and we plug this all into a model, let the model turn. We also put in different, environmental standards, try to make sure we're hitting our goals, and then we get this least cost plan. And the three key factors that we try to keep in mind in the resource planning process is number one, reliability, which goes along with resilience. Number two, affordability. And number three, environmental responsibility. These are all very important as we go through the process. We don't want to overweight one. We want to make sure that we're coming up with a good plan that keeps all these in mind. Next slide. I thought I'd give a quick talk on some of our existing fleet and some new resources that we're building here. Lori alluded to some of this. First bullet point here, after over 60 years in service, we're going to be retiring our 140 megawatt Hoot Lake coal facility. That's already next week here. So we're just finishing up the last of the coal pile, and it'll be turning off for the last time. And we've replaced it with a mix of resources. So the thing about a coal plant is it provides what we refer to as dispatchable energy. That means you can turn it on and off whenever it's needed. And that's very, very important for resilience, especially when you think of when the weather up in this area is well below zero, it's cold. People need to know that when they turn their electric heat on and they turn their light and their stove on, it's going to be there. So dispatchable generation is very important for situations like that. And in order to maintain that dispatchability, we are replacing it. One of the components is, see the middle one there, 248 megawatt natural gas combustion turbine. So that's going to provide us with that dispatchable capability. When the wind's not blowing and the sun isn't shining, we're still going to be able to provide that necessary electricity to our customers. But when the wind is blowing, we're going to be able to capture that with a 150 megawatt Maricourt wind farm, which was completed in 2020. And modern wind technology, it's advanced tremendously. I think we're anticipating about 50% capacity factor, which is very, very high for winds. And as Lori mentioned too, we're going to be building our 50 megawatt Hoot Lake solar plant right on the site of the Hoot Lake coal plant, and that's scheduled to be completed by 2023. And after this fleet change, we're going to be over 30% renewable, and we're actually going to increase our dispatchable capability by more than 100 megawatts. Next slide. Now, something unique about Otter Tail, a unique challenge that we have to face. And you look at our customer base, we have about half of our customers in Minnesota, half of our customers in the Dakotas. And so in order for us to get cost recovery for a new generation asset, we need to get all three states to approve this project through a regulatory proceeding. As a regulated utility, we can't just go build whatever resources we want to build. We need to prove that these resources are indeed in the best interests of our customers. And in Minnesota, we do that through what's called an integrated resource plan, or an IRP. That's a filing we do every 2 to 3 years. And in North Dakota and South Dakota, we file what's called an advanced determination of prudence, where we bring forth a project and justify why, yes, this project is indeed in our customers' best interests. And something that's unique when you look at Minnesota and the Dakotas is earlier I talked about that complex modeling process we go through. In Minnesota, they require us to include externalities and the cost of carbon. So as this model is simulating our generation going forward, every ton of carbon, there's a associated cost that gets added to it. And in the states, North Dakota, we're actually prohibited from including any sort of carbon costs. So when we go through this modeling process to try to find a plan that's least cost in both Minnesota and in the Dakotas, it's becoming more and more challenging as these requirements separate. Next slide. And I think, one way that, or one example of us overcoming these challenges is with this Hoot Lake Solar project. This project is incredibly low cost in terms of utility scale solar. I believe in our hearing, one of the Minnesota commissioners, they mentioned it was the lowest cost solar project that had been brought to them to date. And we were actually able to show that for Minnesota to take all of this project and let the customers take all the benefits and also cover all the costs. It was in Minnesota's best interest, because when we did the modeling with the North Dakota rules, the project, it is getting very low, but it's still just a little too high to be part of a least cost plan in our Dakota jurisdictions. And one of the reasons we were able to get such a low cost project, we were also able to take advantage of a new interconnection process that MISO just started offering. We're actually only the second utility to do this. So our retiring coal facility has all this infrastructure in place. It also has what's referred to as interconnection rights, which as a transmission system fills up, there's less ability to interconnect new resources onto the grid. And these interconnection rights are becoming incredibly expensive. And it used to be that when you retired a unit, you forfeited your interconnection rights, but now MISO is allowing generation owners to maintain these interconnection rights and reuse them for a new resource. So that was another unique thing about this Hoot Lake Solar project that allowed us to show that it was, keep the costs low and show that it was part of a least cost plan in Minnesota. And now, looking forward, we got another IRP coming up due in September 1st of this year. And so we're deep in the modeling process now. We're confident that whatever resources we do determine are in our customers' best interest, we are going to find some unique solutions and be able to prove to all of our jurisdictions that we're still able to provide low cost, reliable, resilience, and environmentally responsible electricity moving forward. Now I'm going to pass it off to, I believe Dean is next.
Advance, Chris, please. Thank you. And I'm Dean Pulowski. I'm the interconnection coordinator here at Otter Tail. And I kind of help interconnections that generators to both our transmission and our distribution system. I'm going to visit with you about our reliability, our grid security, and our interconnections. You want to advance? Before I get too far, I want to make sure everybody understood the electrical system a little bit. Most people probably do, but just a refresher, if nothing else, that when the system was originally built, it had the generators out in the remote areas, which would generate the electricity, step it up, and then it would go across the transmission lines to the neighboring towns and the towns that we'd served. We'd step it down and go into the distribution facilities, which would be within each of the towns. And then right outside the house, there would be another transformer. We would step it down to the voltage that would be in the house. So Chris, if you just want to hit the space bar once. The electrical system was originally designed for the traditional energy flow from the generations, the big generators, out down to the houses. If you want to hit the space bar one more time, Chris. So recently now, the electrical system is starting to see a change where with the DERs, flow is coming back from the distribution system onto the electrical system. And it's finding a new balancing point as to what is being produced by the large generators versus what's being produced by the households. And so it's changing the way the electrical system is operating from the way it was originally designed. And it's a process that we're going through as we get more DERs on. It's an exciting time, but that's not the way it was originally designed. So we're working through that process. But that's kind of just a high level overview of the electrical system. You want to advance, please? There we go. So Chris kind of talked a little bit about the transmission system in MISO, the Mid-Continent Area Power Pool. So there's different regions in the US that have different operators of the transmission system. And there's the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO, which is a lot of time referred to. And that is what the map is on the right. All those different colored, the blue, the green, and the orange is part of the MISO process, or MISO region, or MISO regions. And really, Otter Tail is really involved in the blue region. It's called the West region of MISO with lots of different resources in there. And then, power shared across that whole system. There is another one that's it comes right up to the edge of Morris. It's called the Southwest Power Pool, SPP. That is another grid operator. Otter Tail is part of the MISO grid operator. We turned over the operation of our control and operations of our transmissions to MISO so they can coordinate that with the other utilities and transmission owners in the region. But really the role of MISO is to move the power where it is needed. It takes it from all the big generators or all the generators and moves it to the load. And that provides a lot of resiliency. If you think about the renewable energies, wind moves through the system, it can have lots of wind power at one area, but it can be less windy in another area with less energy. And MISO's big transmission system will help move power to where it needs to be. Or even the sun shines more with clouds in one area and it's raining or it's sunny in another. It helps move that power wherever they need to be. So MISO's goal is to get the lowest cost power across its region. So really in our area, in that blue region, MISO is constantly moving power to where it needs to be, taken from where it can be produced at the lowest cost and moving it. And that's really important with the variable resources that are out on the system these days. And then also having the reliable dispatchable energy that Nate was talking about. The other important thing about the grid is that all of the security that goes on and standards that need to be met to make sure that it's a resilient system. The one thing that we do is every couple of years we have a big exercise throughout all of Minnesota and MISO, in which we run mock simulations about how to operate the grid or what would happen if this event takes place. How do we keep the grid running? How do we get it back up and running? What happens if there's a cyber attack here? Well, and how do we combat that? That's called a Grid X. And it's such a big event that the Minnesota commissioners would actually come up and go out into the outlying areas and watch this take place to make sure that we did have the right protocols in place. And then we also have a bunch of national standards and federal standards that all the grid people need to meet to make sure that it is a resilient and safe and secure system. And we're always running simulations to make sure that we don't have cyber attacks on our system. We get alerts from the federal government, and making sure that this gap is plugged, that you're checking this year things. And then we actually have people come on site every 3 years and go through all of our records to make sure that we have that resilient system that we can always produce that power for the customers that we need. The other thing then that MISO is really in charge of is making sure that they are delivering the best value of energy to the customers throughout their region. And it's the lowest cost energy is what they're trying to do. So a MISO transmission generator that's tying into the transmission system actually puts in a bid the day ahead and says, this is what we're willing to pay, or we're willing to receive money for in order to run tomorrow. And then MISO will take the lowest cost generators and say, you get to run tomorrow. And we've been seeing that price drop over the recent years. And so there is a lot of low cost power out there. And we're starting to see some signals that the generation is getting to be really, I'll say, rather reasonable, and that generators that are coming online, came online 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, are not being dispatched because there's cheaper energy coming online. So, there is lots of generation out there, but it really depends on where you're at, if there's any transmission constraints, and where the load's needed. But that is continually being reduced in price. But with all this generation out there and all the potential that there is for an excitement around distributed generation, the federal government has issued some rules, and MISO and SPP are now trying to put items in place for distributed generation. They can't, the generation on distribution still goes through the state processes, but they're asking for more information on distribution generations because it can impact the transmission system by masking load or just wanting to get some ties into the transmission system. So right now there is a large effort going on in the MISO and SPP trying to understand distribution generation and impacts to the transmission system. If you want to advance, Chris. I mentioned the distribution interconnections, and it's really being driven by those interconnection processes are in the control of the state, they'll say. In Minnesota, we do have a distribution interconnection process. It's been in place for a number of years, probably 15 years or better. The Minnesota Utilities and Commission just went through a big effort about 2 years ago trying to refine that distribution process, and it's common across the state process. So if you want to interconnect into the distribution system, you provide your interconnection request into the distribution provider, which in the city of Morris, that would be Otter Tail. And the distribution provider would do some studies to make sure there's no reliability concerns. And typically for the smaller ones, we're not seeing a lot of those, but if we start getting a number of those, or we get a larger distributed generations, we then will start looking to see, if there are potential impacts on the transmission system, if we're starting to see flows go back the other way, as that balancing point moves between distribution and transmission on where that break point is and where there's flowing back. As we look at the studies, we'll look to evaluate that to see if there are any flows back to transmission and if there are any transmission reliabilities. And again, that's when MISO or SPP may want to start reviewing that to make sure that they have a resilient system. Today, Otter Tail has not seen many issues with distribution interconnections, especially on the small ones. We have seen some localized issues on larger DERs on our system, but there has not been a lot of those. Chris, if you want to advance. This is just a quick, very high level electrical system diagram of the city of Morris, I'll say. The city of Morris is served by 2 substations that Otter Tail has. One is on the north side and one is on the south side. They feed each section of town, and both of those substations are being fed by larger substations that have large transmission lines coming into them. The one on the left of the screen is actually an SPP substation that I talked about, and that is just outside to the west of Morris. And that's receiving a lot of power from the Dakotas, from South Dakota, from the wind turbines out there, and the Big Stone plant and some of the other interconnections out there. The other bigger substation that we have the ability to tie into to provide power in the event that the SPP substation was down would be a Great River Energy substation, which is a MISO substation. So we've got 2 substations surrounding the city of Morris that provides us the ability to bring power in from a couple locations to make sure we can provide the power that the city of Morris needs. On the top of the screen, we have another line that's feeding in, and that line basically goes all the way up to Fergus Falls here. And you can see the Hoot Lake Solar that is on there. That basically ties right into our Hoot Lake facility. So that Hoot Lake Solar that Nate mentioned that we're developing right now will produce power that goes onto a line and basically has a direct feed into the Morris area. The other thing that line has on it is the wind turbines that are just north of Morris in the Hoffman area that ties into that line. So, the city of Morris is receiving power from that section too, and it's renewable energy. The other thing that's depicted on here, you can see is the wind turbines within the city of Morris. And that's the U of M Morris's campus. So, as you all know, there's renewable energy that's being developed there. So the key points of this slide is that really there are a couple different ways to serve power to the city of Morris with 2 different substations that Otter Tail has. Then they're being fed from other resources that have the resiliency of redundant and backup sources. And there's renewable energy all around that can be pulled off the MISO system to provide the power. And the final thing I would note is that the city of Morris, we have 2 feeds, but from both of those substations, and usually they're fed just from the north sub and the south from the south sub. But just to make sure that we can provide the whole town of Morris with power, we do have ties within the city of Morris that if one of our substations goes down, we can back up and provide energy to the full town. So we've got that resiliency and redundancy built into our system. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to finish and talk about demand side.
Great, thank you, Dean. And I just have a couple slides, so I won't take long. I know we're down to just a couple minutes here left. So I'm going to talk about demand side management and some other projects. And again, I'm Jason Grenier, the manager of market planning. If we could jump to the next slide, please. So demand side management is a part of grid resilience. And there's a couple different ways that customers can participate in resilience on the customer side of the meter. One of the ways is through demand response programming. And so Otter Tail controls certain loads in the customer's home, customers that volunteer to have their heating, cooling, or water heating loads control. And so when we see higher prices out in the marketplace, or if there's strain in the grid somewhere, we can go ahead and control those loads. A good example would be that recent polar vortex that Chris was talking about when he opened up is there was strain on the system at that time, and Otter Tail was able to, I shouldn't say there was strain in the system. There was very high prices in the system and probably some strain as well. And Otter Tail was actually able to, system-wide, we controlled a lot of our customers' loads. And because of that, we were actually able to save $8 million in not having to buy extra fuel or extra energy for customers. So it's a big savings when prices in the marketplace were very, very high. And so we use our load management, what we call load management or demand response, to mitigate customers' exposure to high prices or to alleviate strain on the grid. Another way that customers can participate in grid resilience is just using less energy overall. And so conservation, also known as SIP in Minnesota, is a big important piece of that. So I just went back and looked at the last 3 years for Morris. And Morris, the community saved about 3.8 million kilowatt hours. So that's the equivalent to about 653 homes average annual energy usage. And so you think that's very significant. 653 homes is what you guys have saved in the last 3 years. Also, Morris residents, they've received $1.2 million in rebates from Otter Tail in those 3 years by participating in those programs. A lot of times we'll give a rebate for a customer to put in a heat pump or to buy or to discount LED light bulbs, things like that. And then also, because of the participation in those programs have produced $10.2 million in benefits or net benefits actually to customers. So that basically means by reducing energy, Otter Tail hasn't had to go out and generate that energy or procure that energy or capacity. And so there's actually $10.2 million of benefits are going back to customers from those projects that the Morris residents completed. So just some examples there of some of the programs we do. LED lighting for residential, like I said, heat pumps, refrigeration. Pop Solar has been one that you've seen different solar projects around town. Those are part of our publicly owned property solar program. All the street lights in Morris were changed out several years ago to LEDs. I know that was one that Blaine at the city, I know he was happy to see those get changed out. And then we also have several other programs too that customers can participate in. And next slide, please. This next slide basically shows the impact of SIP on the grid. So the blue line is looking at our historical July peak for the system. And if it wasn't for conservation, we would have been way up there at that orange line. So you can see that there was 188 megawatts that we've avoided because of all the conservation that we've done in our system. And Morris has been a big part of that. And so that's equivalent to about 12 communities the size of Morris. So just to think about 188 megawatts, that's basically 12 Morrises we've eliminated their energy usage. That's very significant. So thank you for that. And next slide, please. And then just thinking about some of the future projects to also enhance system resilience. We're working right now with the West Central Research and Outreach Center. We're going to be supporting their ammonia project coming up here for storing or creating ammonia, storing it. And then also we're working with the university on an upcoming battery energy storage project. So we're excited about that one too. And then several local publicly owned solar projects. Those will be POP projects. A lot of interest right now in Morris with these POP solar projects. And so we're excited to work with those. But all these projects will definitely be adding some resiliency to the local area there in Minnesota or in Morris. And then finally, this isn't necessarily resiliency, but I wanted to add it. At least initially it's not resiliency, but someday once we have more EVs in the community, it's likely that we'll be able to push some energy back locally into the grid and create some extra resiliency that way. And so we're going to be investing in some DC fast chargers, and we're going to have a network in Western Minnesota. And I can tell you, if we can get the equipment this year, it's likely to happen in Morris, but it might be next year because equipment's challenging to get. But we're going to probably put in some of the largest EV chargers in Morris that are in the state. And so that's exciting opportunity too for the town. So if you have an EV, you'll be able to charge up really fast. And then next slide, I think that's my last one. I know Lisa's waiting patiently. And so just a conclusion, just a kind of an overview here, just going back through the things that we talked about tonight. We work to ensure grid resilience. And so, we have a nice mix of different generation resources to make sure if the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, we still have that base load to provide customers their needed energy. We go through very deliberate resource and transmission plans, which includes regulators, includes MISO and different customer groups. Dean talked about our grid security, including both physical and cyber. We have redundancy also at the local distribution level where we have multiple substations that can feed the community. And then lastly, as I just talked about, customer participation, demand side management programs. That's also